The day Logan Coyle came home and laid his phone face up on the kitchen counter, he believed he was showing his mother the proudest hour of his life. He had just walked out of the most important interview he would ever sit for, and in the photo glowing on that screen, he stood grinning beside a man he had called, not an hour before, the most brilliant person he had ever met. He had no idea he was looking at his own father, and he had no idea that the woman across the kitchen, his mother, a decorated police detective who had spent 18 years teaching him to hate the man in that picture, was about to let her coffee mug slip out of her hand and shatter on the tile because she knew that face long before he ever spoke the name. To understand why a hardened cop went white at a cell phone photo, and why the founder of one of the biggest software companies in the state had spent half his life building it for a son he was never allowed to hold, we have to go back 18 years. Back to a small town in the flat tobacco country of eastern North Carolina, and to the afternoon they snapped a pair of handcuffs onto a man whose only real crime was dreaming bigger than the people around him could forgive. If a story about pride, a lie that lasted 18 years, and the quiet revenge of simply refusing to fail sounds like your kind of thing, do me one small favor before we get into it. Tap that like button and subscribe to our channel so the next one finds its way to you. That's all. Let's start where it really started. Caleb Mercer grew up just outside Eddington, in a part of the county where the land was flat and the money was thin, and a boy was measured by whether he could hold down steady work. From the time he was small, Caleb couldn't. Not because he was lazy, the opposite. His head was always somewhere else, taking things apart, sketching circuits on the backs of feed receipts, teaching himself to write code on a second-hand computer that wheezed like it was dying. The men at the diner called him a daydreamer. His teachers called him scattered. By the time he was 20, he had a reputation in that town as the Mercer boy with his head in the clouds, the one who was always 2 steps from a fortune and never a dollar closer to one. Then he met Dana. Dana was everything Caleb wasn't. Focused, certain, already in uniform as a sheriff's deputy at 22, the kind of woman who made a plan and executed it without blinking. They fell in love the fast, total way young people do, and for a while Caleb's dreaming looked like vision to her instead of foolishness. They married young. Her family was against it from the first day. To them, Dana was throwing herself away on a man who couldn't keep a job, and they never once let her forget it. Her father told her, at the wedding, that she'd regret it inside 5 years. He was wrong about the timeline. It took less, because Caleb's ideas, brilliant as some of them were, kept dying in the cradle. A computer repair shop that folded when the only other employer in town shut its doors. A piece of software he built that was genuinely ahead of its time, and that he had no money to put in front of anyone who mattered. He wasn't failing because he lacked talent. He was failing because he had talent and nothing else. No capital, no connections, no margin for error. And every time something collapsed, it took a little more of Dana's deputy salary down with it. She was the one keeping the lights on, and she watched the money she earned vanish into one more sure thing that wasn't. Her parents poured poison into the gap. He'll never amount to anything. He's using you. Leave him while you're still young enough to start over. Drop by drop, over 4 years, it wore her down to the bone. The night it broke, she gave him an ultimatum. Make something real of yourself now, she told him, or I'm gone. And Caleb, who could see the shape of what he might one day build but couldn't make her see it, said the worst possible true thing. He said, "Big things take time, Dana. I'm not built for small. I just need you to believe me a little longer." She had heard a version of that promise too many times. She didn't have another year of believing left in her. What Caleb didn't know that night was that she was already pregnant. She found out 2 weeks later, and instead of bringing them back together, it made the decision for her. She lay awake doing the math of a child's whole future, and every column came up the same. If she stayed, he would sink that baby's future the way he'd sunk everything else. So she made the coldest, most deliberate choice of her life. She moved out, she filed for divorce, and she never told him about the child. As far as Caleb knew, his marriage had simply ended. He had no idea that somewhere across the county, a son of his was about to be born. Now jump ahead 4 years. Caleb was still in Eddington, still broke, still grinding. But he had one more idea, and this one he believed in like a man believes in his own heartbeat. All he needed was a little capital to get it off the ground. So he did the hardest thing his pride had ever asked of him. He put on his one good shirt and went to see Gerald Sutton. Sutton was the richest man in the county, owned the big farm equipment dealership out on the highway and half the commercial property in town besides. Caleb sat across that wide desk and laid out his idea, hands shaking a little, and asked for a loan, and Sutton, in front of 2 of his salesmen, laughed at him. He said the only thing a man should lend the Mercer boy was bus fare out of town. He said it loud enough that they heard it in the showroom. Caleb walked out with his ears burning, and that should have been the end of it. But that same evening, nearly $9,000 in cash went missing from the safe in Sutton's back office, and Sutton knew exactly who to blame. The desperate man who'd been in his office that very afternoon begging for money. He didn't have a shred of proof. He didn't need one. He picked up the phone and told the sheriff's office that Caleb Mercer had robbed him. Here's the part that still turns my stomach. The deputy they sent to arrest him was Dana. She pulled up to Ruth Mercer's little farmhouse with the lights flashing, and half the road came out onto their porches to watch. And when Caleb came out, confused, and saw who it was standing there with the cuffs in her hand, something in his face just folded. She didn't soften. She looked at the man she'd once married, standing there in the dirt with the whole town watching, and she said, flat as a closed door, "Worthless was bad enough, Caleb. Now you're a thief, too." She turned him around and cuffed his wrists behind his back and put him in the car. "You know me," he said through the cage. "In your life, you have never once known me to steal a thing. I went to Sutton to ask for a chance. That's all I did." And Dana, eyes on the road, said, "I wasted years of my life learning exactly who you are. Don't tell me I don't know you." They booked him. They put him in a holding cell, and Caleb sat on a steel bench under a buzzing light and felt the last of his name in that town slip away from him. But what neither he nor Dana knew was that the truth was already walking up the steps of that station, on its own 2 feet. His name was Wayne Tully. Wayne was a local handyman who'd been drinking himself into the ground for years, the kind of man most people crossed the street to avoid. He'd done some odd jobs around Sutton's lot, knew the back office, knew the safe, and in a bad hour he'd taken the money. But Wayne also knew Caleb Mercer. He knew that Caleb was the one man in that whole county who had never once looked at him like garbage, who'd handed him a few dollars when he was hungry, given him work, sat and talked to him like he was a person. And when word got around the bar that they'd arrested Caleb for Wayne's theft, the drunk found something at the bottom of himself that he'd thought was long gone. A conscience. He walked into the station, laid the money on the counter, and turned himself in. Just like that, Caleb was cleared. Donna had to release him, and it cost her something to do it. She'd been so sure. She walked him to the door, and even then she couldn't let it go. "You got lucky," she said. "Do yourself a favor and stay away from decent people." Caleb didn't even have the energy to answer her, and then, as he was halfway out the door, a phone rang at the desk behind her. It was a young officer who took it, and Caleb heard him say, "Detective, sorry, it's your sitter. She says your boy won't stop crying. He's asking for you." Caleb stopped walking. He turned around very slowly. "Your boy?" he said. "Dana, you have a son?" For 1 second her face gave everything away. Then it closed again, harder than before. "I have a son," she said. "Not you. He is mine. And you will never, as long as you live, lay eyes on him." Caleb did the math right there on the spot, the timing, the 4 years, the way she'd vanished, and the floor dropped out from under him. That child was his. He had a son he had never even known was born. "Let me see him once," he said, and his voice cracked clean in half. "Just once, Dana. He's mine." And she looked at him with something that wasn't quite hatred, something more like fear dressed up as certainty, and she said, "A boy raised anywhere near a man like you would learn one thing and one thing only: how to fail. I will not let your shadow fall across that child." And she made him leave. Caleb didn't go quietly into that good night. He tried to fight. He scraped together what little he had and sat down across from a legal aid lawyer in a strip mall office, and he asked how he could get to his son. The lawyer was kind, and the lawyer was brutally honest. A broke man with no home of his own, no steady job, and a theft arrest on his record. Dropped or not, it was there, going up against a respected sheriff's deputy in her own county, in front of judges who played golf with her boss. He would not win. He might not even get supervised visits. And every month he dragged it through court, he'd be putting that little boy in the middle of a war between his parents. So Caleb made the hardest decision of his entire life. He decided he would not fight from his knees. He would not let the last thing his son ever heard about him be that he'd lost again, the way they all said he would. Instead, he would disappear. He would go somewhere new and he would build something so real, so undeniable, that no one, not Dana, not her family, not one soul in Eddington, could ever again put the word worthless in the same sentence as his name. And then, one day, from a position no one could sneer at, he would find his way back to his boy. He went home and told his mother everything. Ruth Mercer was getting on in years, and the farm was the only thing the family had left in the world. Caleb sat at her kitchen table with a bruise on his cheekbone and his name in ruins, and told her about the arrest, about the son he wasn't allowed to see, about the plan that sounded insane even as he said it out loud. And Ruth, who had spent her whole life watching the world misjudge her strange, brilliant boy, did the one thing nobody else ever had. She believed him. She sold the farm. She put every dollar of it in his hands, and she said, "Then go build it, and take me with you." Together they moved to Raleigh, 2 hours west and a whole world away, into a cramped apartment in the shadow of the Research Triangle. Now, Caleb knew his Dana. He knew she was practical to the marrow, and he knew she'd push that boy toward the most respectable, highest-paying future she could imagine. And in that part of North Carolina, that meant one thing: technology, software. The Triangle ran on it. So Caleb bet the rest of his life on a single quiet certainty, that one day, somewhere down the road, his son would walk into that world, and he would be waiting in it. He went all in. He took every contract coding job he could find and slept 4 hours a night. He failed and learned and failed smaller and learned faster. He built a tool to solve a problem he'd lived, and a few people paid for it, and then a few hundred, and then a few thousand. He hired one engineer, then 5, then 50. He named the company Meridian Systems, and slowly, over years that turned his hair gray, the daydreamer from Eddington became something nobody back home would have believed. The self-made founder of one of the most respected software firms in the Southeast, he never remarried. People asked, and he'd just smile and change the subject. The truth was he already had a family in his head, a boy whose face he'd never seen, and there wasn't room in his heart for a substitute. And in all those 18 years, he did one thing that his own board of directors thought was a harmless eccentricity. He insisted on personally conducting the final interview for every new graduate Meridian hired out of the local universities. Every single one. His people thought the old man just liked young talent. The real reason was simpler and sadder than that. It was the one way he could think of that. Someday, a particular young man might walk through his door, and he'd be there to see it. 18 years after that afternoon in the holding cell, that day finally came. Logan Coyle was 22, top of his graduating class in computer science at NC State, and he had just landed a final round interview at Meridian Systems. The company every grad in the Triangle would have killed to work for. He'd heard the rumor that the founder did the last interview himself, and he was so nervous he'd ironed his cheap suit twice. He gave his name at the front desk and rode the elevator up and was shown into an office with one entire wall of glass, the whole city laid out gold and far below. The man behind the desk had his back turned, looking out at that view, and when he heard the door and turned around, for just a second, the founder of Meridian Systems looked like a man who'd been struck. His eyes filled. He mastered it almost instantly, the way you'd master a flinch, and Logan, jangling with nerves, barely registered it. "Come in," the man said. "Sit. Let's see what you've got." He took Logan's resume in two hands and read it slowly, and when he reached the section at the bottom, the family, the emergency contacts, he went very still. Where the father's name should have been, there was nothing. In its place, and in the mother's place both, was written the same single name, Dana Coyle. "Your father," Caleb said, and it took everything he had to keep his voice level. "What's his name? What does he do?" Logan answered the way he'd answered it his whole life, flat and a little defiant. "I don't have one, sir. He took off, or my mom left him. She says he was a worthless dreamer who couldn't hold a dollar, ended up a thief. I never met him. My mother raised me by herself, so I put her down for both. Far as I'm concerned, that's the truth of it." Caleb absorbed that the way a wall absorbs a fist. Then he set the resume down, folded his hands, and said, "All right, let me show you something." He stood, walked to the whiteboard that covered half of one wall, and began to write. He wrote out a programming problem, a long, dense, ferocious thing, and when he capped the marker, he said, "You have 5 minutes. Solve it." Logan looked at the board and felt the blood leave his face. He was a topper, the best in his class, and he could see at a glance that this problem was something else entirely. The kind of thing that would take a team a full day, if they could crack it at all. He tried anyway. He scratched out a few crooked lines that he knew were going nowhere, his marker squeaking in the silence, sweat starting at his collar. After a couple of minutes, he just stopped, defeated, and the man watching him didn't gloat. He smiled, almost gently. "It's all right," he said. "It's a hard one, I know." Then he took the marker out of Logan's hand, stepped up to the board, and solved the entire thing in perhaps 10 seconds. Clean, impossible, beautiful, the answer unspooling like he was simply remembering it rather than working it out. Logan stared. "Sir," he breathed, "you're a genius. Where do you even learn to think like that?" And Caleb, looking at his own handwriting on the board, said quietly, "Not in any classroom. I learned every bit of this the hard way, the long way, by failing at almost everything for a very long time, until I didn't." Logan was so moved he forgot to be nervous. "Sir, would it be all right if I got a photo with you? I don't even care if I get the job. I just want to be able to say I once stood next to a mind that worked like that." Caleb said yes. He came around the desk and he set his hand on the young man's shoulder, and for one breath he let it rest there, the only time in 18 years he had ever touched his son. And Logan held up the phone and took the picture. Then Caleb gave him the 2 conditions. "The job is yours, Logan. Truly. But on 2 terms. First, that problem you couldn't solve? I expected that. No fresh graduate on Earth could solve it, because it isn't in any textbook. It's the kind of thing you only learn by living a hard life for a long time and paying attention." He paused, and here his voice changed, dropped, went somewhere private. "Second, go home and find out your father's name and what he does for a living. The day you bring me back a resume with your father's name written in that blank, you start work that morning." Logan thought it was a strange, easy thing to ask. He shook the great man's hand and floated out of that building and drove home certain his future was sewn up. His mother was waiting at the door for the news. He told her he'd gotten it, practically, and then he laughed and told her about the odd little condition. "Weirdest thing," he said. "He wants me to find out my dad's name and what he does, like it matters." Dana didn't laugh. She went very quiet. Then she said she'd handle it, and she stepped into the other room and made a phone call to an old colleague from the county, retired now, and asked, as casually as she could manage, whatever had become of a man named Caleb Mercer. She listened, and the longer she listened, the more the color drained out of her face. Because the answer coming down the line was this. Caleb Mercer owned Meridian Systems. The man she had branded a worthless thief in front of the whole town was, by any measure that town understood, the most successful self-made man it had ever produced. She came back into the kitchen unsteady on her feet, and Logan, oblivious, still glowing, said, "Mom, you've got to see. I met the most brilliant man today. I got a picture." And he turned the phone around to face her. She saw the face beside her son's. The mug slipped out of her hand and hit the tile and burst apart, and she didn't even look down at it. "Mom," Logan said. "Mom, what's wrong with you?" It took her a long time to find the words. When she did, they came out in pieces. Logan, the man in that photo, standing next to you, she had to stop and start again. That's your father. For a moment, Logan simply couldn't make the sentence mean anything. 18 years of worthless and thief and good-for-nothing sat in his chest like furniture, and the words wouldn't move around it. No, he said. You told me he was nothing. You told me he was a criminal. I wrote your name where his was supposed to go. I did that because of what you told me. And Dana, the unshakable detective, broke. She tried to explain it, that she'd been young and terrified, that she'd watched him fail, and she couldn't bear to gamble a child's whole life on one more promise. That she'd told herself every single day for 18 years that the lie was a kindness, that she was protecting him, but Logan was barely hearing her. He was somewhere else, putting it together. He cried when I walked in, he said slowly. Just for a second I saw it, and I thought it was nothing. His voice went very low. He built a problem only he could solve, just so I'd ask him who he was. He stood up, he didn't shout, he didn't threaten her, didn't say a cruel word. He just looked at his mother like he was seeing the whole shape of his life for the first time, and he said, I have to go. And he went. He drove across the city to Meridian with his hands shaking on the wheel. It was long after closing. The building was dark. But up on the top floor, behind that wall of glass, one light was still burning, because Caleb had known. He'd known the boy would take that photo to his mother, and he'd known what would happen when she saw it, and he had simply sat down to wait, the way he'd been waiting, in one way or another. For 18 years, Logan came off the elevator and stopped in the doorway, and the first thing out of him was the only question that mattered. If you were my father this whole time, why didn't you ever come for me? So Caleb told him, all of it. The arrest, the lie, the lawyer in the strip mall, the impossible math of a poor man fighting a cop in her own county, the choice to stop fighting from his knees and start building instead, the company, the 18 years. The final interviews he'd insisted on conducting himself, year after year, for a reason his own board never guessed. I didn't build all of this to be rich, son, he said. I built it so that one day a door would open and you would be standing in it, and I'd be someone they couldn't lie about anymore. I couldn't come to you as the man they said I was. I had to first become the man I actually am. And Logan crossed the room and put his arms around a father he'd met for the first time that morning. And for a while, neither of them said anything at all. It was a sound in the doorway that finally made them look up. Dana was standing there. She had followed her son across the city. The proud woman who'd snapped the cuffs on this man and called him worthless in the dirt now stood in the doorway of everything he'd built without her, and she had nowhere left to hide. This is the part where, in a softer story, she'd have fallen at his feet, and he'd have forgiven her in a rush, and they'd have all gone home a family. That isn't what happened. What happened was quieter, and harder, and more true. She didn't perform her sorrow. She just stood there in the wreckage of 18 years and said the costliest thing she had. I told myself I was protecting him. I think I was protecting myself from being the woman who married wrong, who everyone said married wrong. She looked at the floor. I was wrong about you, Caleb. I have never in my life been so wrong about anything. And Caleb did not melt. He looked at the mother of his son, at the woman who'd cost him 18 birthdays and first steps and bedtime stories, and what he felt was not triumph and not the old love either. It was just tired. I forgive you, Dana, he said, not because you've earned it. You haven't, not yet, maybe not for a long time. I forgive you because I have carried this for 18 years, and I'm done being bent under the weight of it. He paused. But you and I are not walking back into something that was already broken long before any of this. That's gone. It's been gone a long time. What he wanted now, he told her, was one thing only, that Logan would get to have both his parents in his life, without a war between them in the middle of it. A careful peace, an incomplete one. The only honest kind there was one more place to go that night. Caleb drove his son out to a quiet house at the edge of the city, where an old woman lay propped up in a bed by the window. Ruth Mercer, who had sold the only thing she owned on nothing but faith in her boy. and whose health was failing her now. She'd waited a long time. When Caleb led Logan into that room and said, "Mama, this is him. This is your grandson," the old woman's eyes filled and spilled over, and she reached up a thin hand toward a face she'd been told she'd never get to see. Nobody said very much. There wasn't a need. Some things are too full for words, and that was one of them. Here's what I keep turning over, though. Long after the lights go down on a story like this one, Caleb Mercer could have spent 18 years being angry. He had every right to. Instead, he spent them building, and when the door finally opened and his son walked through it, he didn't ask that boy to hate the woman who'd lied to him. He just let the truth stand in the room and speak for itself. He answered everyone who'd ever called him worthless not with revenge, but by quietly becoming undeniable. And the only prize he ever actually wanted out of any of it was the boy. So let me leave you with this, and I'd genuinely like to know where you land. Was Dana protecting her son all those years? Or was she protecting her own pride? And if you'd lost what Caleb lost, could you have forgiven her the way he did? Tell me in the comments. I read them. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you after the screen goes dark, take a second to subscribe to our channel before you go. There's always another one on the way.